Hello and welcome to this video lecture for the University of Connecticut's online course, Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies 1103, Classical Mythology. I'm Roger Travis, Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Connecticut, and whether you're enrolled in this course or not, I hope you enjoy the lecture and learn something about new ways of looking at classics and at myth. Thanks for watching.
Now, as I said in an earlier segment, during the teens of the era just before the turn from BCE to CE, that is 20 to 10 BCE, Augustus is engaged in this program of moral reform, the keystone of which is his family legislation. And just to remind you, that includes the criminalization of adultery and fines for upper-class Romans who fail to have families. Just to point out the completely obvious, if there weren't adultery and immoral practices going on in Rome at that time, Augustus wouldn't see any need, one has to presume, to enact this legislation. And so what we're talking about is a culture of adultery and what Augustus presumably sees as loose family values, and Augustus trying to change that. And then Ovid coming into the mix with, first of all, the Amores, and then later, and in pretty direct opposition to the Augustan moral program, this amazing work called the Are Zama Toria, the art of the lover. And it really is a manual in poetry of how to pick up girls in ancient Rome, including a classic early version of the famous movie Reach, where the guy who's sitting next to the girl that he wants to get further with in their romantic relationship will stretch out his arms behind him and then let his arm come to rest around the shoulders of his beloved girl. Well, in the first book of the Are Zama Toria, Ovid tells the guy who's sitting next to the girl he wants to get further with at the Colosseum to pretend that he sees some crumbs on her bosom and to brush them off. In that sense, at least, our modern sexual mores are tamer than the ancient Roman ones. Really, as we'll see in Ovid, our modern mores are much tamer in a lot of ways than ancient Roman mores. Anyway, the Are Zama Toria has 4 books of this kind of material with mythological exempla thrown in for good measure, and it's pretty clearly this work that gets Ovid in trouble with Augustus. Now, the next part of Ovid's career is a little bit vague, and according to him, in some of the stuff that he writes in exile, he is done with the Metamorphoses before he is sent into exile. But in any case, what I'm going to try to do as we go through the Metamorphoses is to show you that whether or not Ovid is actually writing it from exile, Ovid is clearly, as he is writing it, conscious of the fact that he has gotten himself into serious trouble with Augustus and that his poetry has caused him some problems. At the same time, one of the best things about the Metamorphoses is that Ovid is not afraid, nevertheless, to criticize Augustus under cover in such a way that only somebody who's really reading closely, who really understands poetry and understands all of Ovid's references, that is, unlike Augustus, who, although he could tell who was a good poet, didn't have a lot of skill in that area himself. Only a reader who knows mythological poetry inside and out will be able to see how critical the Metamorphoses actually is of Augustus. That's the background you need then to understand the reason for the Metamorphoses, and in particular the reason for it to begin the way it does. The other thing you need to know is just what metamorphosis means, and it really just means change over. And so the theme of the work from the very beginning is going to be change, and what I'm going to talk about now is what the actual very first changeover in Metamorphoses is. And after all of that stuff about the background, about the meter, about Ovid, about Augustus, you're now prepared to understand just how clever Ovid is about creating that very first metamorphosis. So here we go. Like I said before, elegiac distich is the meter of love, and dactylic hexameter is the meter of epic. epic defined most of all as what is going on in the Iliad and what's going on in the Aeneid, and to a lesser extent what's going on in the Odyssey. The Iliad has always felt to be the epic, that is, war, death, glory, heroism in a standard warrior vein. And the Metamorphoses is in dactylic hexameter. But ancient Roman editions of poetry don't have those convenient indents that tell us that we're dealing with elegiac couplets. So a Roman looking at a page of elegiac distich and a page of dactylic hexameter wouldn't immediately be able to tell the difference. He or she would have to read 2 lines in and realize somewhere towards the end of the second line that in fact the meter of this poem is elegiac distich instead of dactylic hexameter, or dactylic hexameter instead of elegiac distich. Now remember that Ovid's entire career to the point when he writes Metamorphoses has been in elegiac distich, and above all as a poet of love. Love in an immoral, fun, humorous way, but love nonetheless. So here he is at the very beginning of his new work, this epic, which is really very, very unlike the Iliad and even the Odyssey, but is in dactylic hexameter, and so within the cultural context of ancient Rome equals epic. Here he is starting out an epic, and this is the way he starts it. In nova fert animus mutatas dicere formas, corpora di coiptis namvos mutastis et illa ad spiratem meis prima quab origine mundi ad mea perpetuum deducite tempora carmen. So what does it mean? Well, the first 2 lines are the ones that concern us the most, but the passage as a whole means, of bodies changed to other forms I tell, you gods who have yourselves wrought every change, inspire my enterprise and lead my lay in one continuous song from nature's first remote beginnings to our modern times. That's Melville's translation of the first 5 lines of the Metamorphoses. Now let's look closely at those first 2.5 lines to see what I'm going to tell you is the very first metamorphosis of the work. In nova fert animus mutatas dicere formas corpora. My mind brings me to tell of forms having been changed into new bodies. So far, so good. The first line of elegiac distich and the first line of dactylic hexameter are going to be the same. They're both lines of dactylic hexameter. Notice also the prominence of the word mutatas here, having been changed, indicating that the theme of the Metamorphoses is, as one might expect, change. Now on to the second line where things get a little weird. Di coiptis namvos mutastis et illa ad spiratem meis. Gods, on my beginnings, that's coiptis meis, ad spirata, breathe favorably. Okay, now the parenthesis, which is the crucial part. Nam vos mutastis et illa, for you all, vos is plural, have changed illa, those things, to. That's et. Imagine for a moment you're an ancient Roman reader. You're reading the second line of a new poem by Ovid, and you think it's going to be an elegiac distich. And what you do is you go, corpora di coiptis nam vos mutast, what? Or in Latin, quid? What's Ovid doing? Well, here's what Ovid's doing. At the word mutastis, Ovid has become an epic poet, because the word mutastis is the moment where Ovid's beginnings are changed from the beginnings of a love poet to the beginnings of an epic poet. What does it mean that the gods have changed those things to? It means he is now an epic poet, his beginnings are different, and there is the beginning of the slightest dig at Augustus for the misfortune that caused Ovid to have to give up love poetry and become this epic poet who is now compelled to write a work that's going to be critical in a cryptic and very funny way of the rule of Augustus.